Today we're going to be talking about how you can supercharge power brands with challenger thinking. So hopefully that's what you're expecting and you're in the right place. Firstly, just a very quick intro. Hello, I'm Susie Milburn. I'm one of the strategy team here at Eat Big Fish. And for those who are less familiar with us, maybe, we are a global strategic brand consultancy, and essentially we help ambitious brands and businesses challenge the expected. And to do this, we draw on over 25 years of research into how challenger brands rewrite the rules of strategy, culture, innovation, brand narratives, and much more recently, attention. So some of the books and research I can take no credit for writing are here on this slide. But, essentially, we are fascinated by challenger brands and what we can learn from them and how we can apply that to the way that we might think about the brands that we're building. So why are we doing this webinar? Why are we interested in particular in power brands and looking at kind of CPG? Well, we're interested in power brands for two reasons. It's not a term that we've kind of coined or anything. It's something I'm sure you'll be familiar with. There's a definition of it here on screen. So, brands that essentially perhaps are the holy grail. They can achieve both mass market appeal and they can charge premium prices. So, a really good thing for us all to aspire for, and perhaps the thing that feels like it can often be a bit of a balancing act. And we're interested in power brands specifically for two reasons. Firstly, because we think they're the ones who are really having to rethink the way that they operate today, especially if they're in the CPG landscape. So to say times are tough and the headwinds are kind of ramping up for power brands is probably an understatement. Apologies for the slightly jovial picture for what is actually, a really difficult time to be in the market. So whether it's the cost of tariffs, there was an article recently in the FT that said, I think P&G were facing $1 billion hit from tariffs alone. Supply chain volatility isn't going away, costs are going up there. And actually, there's some really interesting consumer data recently that suggests that actually shoppers are looking for value both at both ends of the spectrum, and they're changing some of their spending habits accordingly. So really, if you're a brand, sales and your profit are both under pressure, and if you're a power brand, you're probably feeling this a bit more acutely than some of the other brands in the market. At the same time, the private label fishing trawler, as my colleague Jono brilliantly coined it, also feels like it's probably a bit, it's ramping up, it's becoming unstoppable. So there's this huge rise of private label, not just kind of competing on value, but creating brands of their own and competing quite aggressively in the market. And so no doubt that's a worry for kind of any brand marketer in this area. And secondly, we're interested in power brands because they're often seen to be kind of the opposite of what people think a challenger brand is. So we're seeing a lot of these kind of headlines shining a light on the new kind of scrappy, quote unquote, challengers who are winning and seem to be the only ones growing market share, especially when you look at things like innovation. So this kind of report headline on the bottom left. And this report at the top is one that Bain released earlier this year. They talk about insurgent brands. They define those as brands that are over 25 million in revenue, growing fast, and also mostly independent. So quite an interesting proxy for challenger brands. And they found that those brands held under 2% market share, but they contributed 39% of category growth last year. And even more kind of worryingly, if you're a power brand, that 39% was up from 17% in 2023. So maybe rather than behaving more like a challenger, if you're kind of a big power brand or a big power brand house, lots of them are responding in this way. They're responding through acquisition. They're buying the challengers to boost their portfolio, boost their share of growth. Couple of examples here that I'm sure you've seen. Unilever announced their acquisition of Wild deodorant, the kind of refillable deodorant brand. Earlier in the year, they announced that they're acquiring Dr. Squatch, another deodorant brand, in that space a few weeks ago. PepsiCo, I think someone put this in the chat at the beginning, bought Poppy for nearly $2 billion this year. And on the bottom right, Church & Dwight, they announced their acquisition of this hand sanitizer brand, Touchland, I think for about 700 million earlier in the year. So, it might seem like the easier thing or the kind of the natural thing to do is to try and bring some of these brands into your portfolio if you're managing a portfolio of really established brands. Or the other thing I think that we're all kind of seeing is that these really well-known established brands are learning and borrowing from some of these challenges when it comes to successful, what successful innovation looks like. And we know that innovation is still one of the most powerful levers for growth. And we're seeing a huge number of power brands adding kind of endless line extensions to their products, maybe borrowing flavors, ingredients from what's trending elsewhere. So probiotics in kitchen spray, would you believe? Protein in yogurt, or this kind of revolving door of weird and wonderful flavors if you're in the coffee world. Just a couple of examples that feel like they're kind of bubbling up in the market. And again, this is on the rise. So there was a really interesting report from Intel that suggested 65% of new product launches last year were renovations. So kind of, line extensions, things that were building on existing products rather than perhaps kind of true innovation as we might think about it. And even more kind of startling, maybe that kind of 65% is the highest it's been in the last 30 years. And we'd probably question whether this is really working. So if 76% of new product launches are failing and 2/3 of those aren't achieving kind of, critical unit sales, then actually perhaps kind of neither of these responses, if you're a power brand, if you're an established brand, are enough in this kind of difficult time and when we're kind of facing even more challenges and challengers. Now, of course, I suppose if you are kind of a power brand, if you're established, if you're the market leader, then this kind of, maybe this more incremental approach makes sense. So we're all familiar with the loss aversion theory from Daniel Kahneman. So, we're more worried about what we might lose than what we might gain. And so it's natural, I guess, if you're in the position of strength, to focus on incremental gains, to focus on optimizing, to focus on mitigating risks, and let the kind of scrappy or kind of newer startups who actually have nothing to lose take the risks and forge ahead. But there's a big risk in this approach. So if you're too focused on maintaining your brand or your business as it is, thinking about how you might grow incrementally or how you might just optimize for the current times, then what you're doing effectively is you're letting these kind of so-say challengers move the category forward, progress their brands, but also challenge what the category might be about. And importantly, they're moving things forward on their terms. So our provocation in this webinar is that we believe challenger is not a function of your market share. It's not a function of your market size. It's certainly not about how long you've been around. We believe challenger is a mindset. So you can choose to think like the incumbent in your category, maintaining the status quo, keeping things perhaps as they might have worked for you in the past. Or you can choose to think like a challenger and move the category forward, really challenging some of the kind of incumbent thinking or the ways that things might have been done before. And importantly, it's a mindset that even power brands must embrace if they're going to kind of not just kind of keep up, but if they're going to continue to lead the categories that they're in. And of course, some of the best brands that we're all familiar with know this better than others. So, they might be kind of under a bit of scrutiny at the moment, Nike, but at their best, they kind of, they said, we are the industry Goliath because we think like the industry David. So keeping this mindset within, really established and kind of well-known organizations and brands, we believe is really critical to success, even in kind of difficult times. And, there's lots of data to support that this is maybe more important than it ever has been. So you'll probably be familiar with Kantar's Brand Z study. So they've been tracking the top 100 global brands every year for the last 20 years. And what's really interesting, they released some data, I think in 2023. What's really interesting is over time, they've seen that the brands, and these are the biggest, most powerful brands in the world, the brands that are growing penetration start with a significant advantage in difference. So they measure meaning, they measure difference, they measure salience. And we might have been trained to think that, salience is really the most important thing. It's the thing that helps you gain distribution. It's the thing that keeps mental availability, all of those kind of brilliant basics of marketing. But actually what they're seeing is that over time, difference is becoming an even more powerful lever for growth. And at the same time, the impact of salience is decreasing. So not saying all these things aren't just, aren't still important, but perhaps being kind of big and well known on its own isn't enough anymore. So that's our provocation. Challenger is a mindset, and it's a mindset that even power brands need to embrace. So We're going to offer you 3 ways you can embrace a challenger mindset. We'll be sharing some examples of challengers that we think do this brilliantly, that we can all learn from. And we're going to give you a couple of examples of kind of power brands, to use that phrase, who have really found success in thinking like a challenger. So a question for you all to think about as you listen and leave this session. Keep this kind of this matrix in your head. So, really think about, where are you really at the moment? Are you thinking like an incumbent? Are you maintaining the way things are? Or are you thinking like a challenger? And hopefully more so after this webinar, at least. Brilliant. So yeah, as Jamie said, we will take questions at the end. We love to see your comments. Please add into the chat, or there's a Q&A function, I think, on the webinar. So please do kind of keep adding to that as we go, and we'll come back to that when we close. So 3 ways you can embrace a challenger mindset. The first way that you can really embrace this mindset is to raise your ambition. So challenges, one of the ways we define challenges is that they have ambitions greater than their resources. Now, this might be because they have limited resources, limited budget, limited market share, distribution, talent, whatever they might be. But it's also because they deliberately and consistently set the bar higher. They set their ambitions higher. They continue to raise their ambitions. So challengers like Discovery, who are one of the fastest growing financial service providers in South Africa. This is their CEO talking about, they set impossible goals and they settle for mildly impossible solutions. Now, this might be the opposite to how you want to react when kind of you feel like everything's coming at you like that dog in the picture. Most of us would kind of instinctively batten down the hatches. We might adjust our ambitions. We might accept that perhaps we're not going to have the best year when things are tough. But actually, we think that's kind of the risky way to do things. So the question to think about, is your ambition big enough, or are you just settling for incremental growth at the expense of something bigger? And one of the really simple ways you can start to think about raising your ambition is by changing your competitive set. So one of our favourite challenges at Eat Big Fish at the moment is a brand called Bold Beans. If you haven't heard of them, highly recommend you check them out, if not online in kind of real life. They are a UK-based jarred bean brand, and they're on a mission to make us all bean obsessed. I think they've done a pretty good job with all of us at Eat Big Fish. But, beans is a fairly big market, tinned and ambient food is as well. So, most new brands in this space, most bean brands would be looking at other bean brands. They might be setting their sights on the tinned food aisle at a stretch. But we interviewed their founder, Amelia, earlier this year, and she said, we set a much bigger bar than that. We have a very different sense of what good looks like. She said, I don't see our competitor as canned beans. I want beans at all meal times. So, they see their competitors as things like avocado toast, scrambled eggs, a piece of fish. And all of a sudden, they're setting a much bigger ambition, which means that they're going to have to behave differently to the way they might have thought, or some of the other kind of competitors that might have existed in their competitive set before. And that's why they do things like publishing best-selling cookbooks. They overcommit to collaborations with top chefs like Ottolenghi. I saw this week they've just announced a partnership with a leading supermarket in the UK, serving bold beans on the lunchtime menu in their cafes. So, they're really kind of changing their competitive set in the category, and they're raising their ambition, forcing themselves to do something differently as a result. And it's no coincidence they've tripled their distribution. They've seen, I think their unit sales have grown over 300% last year. And for comparison, the jarred beans category, as they might have seen their competitors, grew just 6%. So they're achieving disproportionate growth by thinking differently about their competitive set and the category that they operate in. A more familiar example, it's not a webinar unless someone talks about liquid death, so I'm going to do it quickly. But, a really brilliant example of this as well, not just because they are kind of deliberately not competing with other water brands, but their founder, Mike Cesario, talks about raising their ambition far outside their category and even kind of the other things that you might buy in a supermarket. So they raise their ambition by seeing the likes of Netflix and entertainment as a competitor. So they're thinking not just about what other products their audience might be buying. They're thinking about who they're competing for when it comes to attention. So if you really want to kind of raise your ambition, thinking about your competitive set as who else you're competing for attention with is actually a really interesting question to ask, and starts to make you think very differently about, you know, the ambition you set for your brand and the things that you might need to do to really kind of cut through. Now, if you're raising your ambition, you're also probably thinking differently about the criteria of choice in the category that you're in. So let's look at hand sanitizer. I'm sure you are all on the edge of your seats at this point, but bear with, because it's a category that's really interesting. So first of all, it has a very dominant and a very functional criteria of choice. Surprise, surprise, it's all about killing germs, or more specifically about killing 99.9, or in some cases, 99.99% of bacteria. So, you know, it's built on efficacy, it's built on performance. Consumers are trained to look out for these criteria of choice around kind of killing bacteria. And marketers or brand owners in that category seem to be on this kind of never-ending quest for that extra decimal place. Really, it's impossible to make gains unless you're going to rewrite the rules of that category. Otherwise, you're just in this kind of race to the bottom on decimal places, quite literally. And so really, you know, the best way to win here is about changing the criteria of choice. This brand, I mentioned them really briefly earlier, they are also a hand sanitizer. So this is Touchland. As I said, they've seen huge success in the last 5 years. I think they're now number 2 in the US hand sanitizer market in less than kind of 5 years. And actually, when you think about how popular that category is, how much attention it's had since COVID, it's a pretty incredible feat that they've managed to achieve. And what they've done brilliantly is that they've changed the criteria of choice in their category. So for them, it's no longer just about germs or bacteria, but actually when you look at their products, they have the same credentials in that space. They kill the same amount of bacteria. They're selling their brand and their product based on joy and delight. So their founder talks about the existing criteria of choice in that category just inherently being born out of fear. And they set out to do completely the opposite. So we love this copy on their website. They talk about bringing little bursts of joy that can delight our senses and remind us of the magic in the mundane. So it sounds a far cry from those images that we just shared of lots of the big brands and the established brands in that category. And when you look at how they show up, we notice them for a reason. So here are just a few examples from things they've done recently on TikTok, where they deliberately show up much more like a beauty brand. You know, they're focused on bringing these kind of bursts of joy and delight than a sanitizer brand. So, you know, people are talking about Touchland as something they can't wait to get their hands on in this second image. I don't think anyone's ever said that about Dettol. It's an accessory. It's something that you display proudly on your handbag. And it's seen in all the right places with all the right people. Their influencer campaign around the US Open this year was a masterclass, but again, it's nothing, you know, it's not what you would expect a sanitizer brand to be part of or to be doing. So changing the criteria of choice in your category is a brilliant way to raise your ambition and, you know, by necessity, think about what you might do differently. And just one final example here, and this is a brand, Surf, who a power brand that eatbigfish worked with a few years back. So they were facing a challenge. They were squeezed between kind of the value and the premium space in detergent. And they were really struggling to win in a category that had just become obsessed with stain removal and whiteness. And also at the time, you know, if you were a value brand for consumers, the value equation was really just built on this idea of less for less. You were accepted that you were going to get slightly less because you were paying much less. And this, if you're a brand like Surf, this is just a really dangerous game to play. So you're already in a race to the bottom on functional terms, and you're kind of trying to compete on just delivering less for less at each time. So Surf did two things. Firstly, they recognized that they could change this value equation. So rather than offering less for less, they could offer more of something else for less. So they looked at other brands at the time, brands like IKEA, who were really kind of challenging the value equation, you know, offering more design for less price. And the second thing that they did was that they looked outside of the world of detergent. They looked at other categories to kind of see what was emerging and what else was going on. And they saw that in categories like fragrance and kind of other home categories, there was a growing trend for candles, for scent, for this kind of sensory overload. And also brands like Lush, the kind of beauty or kind of personal care brand, who have their brilliant kind of very vibrant and multi-sensory displays. They were just really embracing a very different kind of intensity in the category. And, you know, for the right person, that really appealed and it really cut through. So as a result, they made a really bold move and they changed the criteria of choice away from stain removal, away from whiteness and whiter whites, and changed it to be about kind of fragrance, about vibrancy. And they started talking about gorgeous laundry for less. They formulated a completely different language to talk about detergent, and you know, and this had a huge impact on how they evolved their product range. So they started putting essential oils in their products, which, by the way, were just as effective, but they gave their consumers a really different kind of criterion by which to choose their detergent. And testament to any good brand strategy, it's still something that they do today. I think this is one of their recent ad campaigns. They're still a brand for people who want laundry that smells that good. So some brilliant examples in there of how you can raise your ambition, not just by looking outside your immediate competitors and thinking about how you might redefine your competitive set, but also about thinking how can you change the criteria of choice? What are the current criteria of choice in your category? And what are the other rules that you can play? What are the other rules, sorry, that you can win by? So that's our first challenge, I suppose, to all of you. How can you raise your ambition by thinking in that way? The second way that you can embrace the challenger mindset is by challenging something. Now, no surprise that we're fans of challenging. But a challenger mindset really is one that looks to progress the brand, your brand and your category. Progress your brand and your business, but also to progress the category that you're in. So lots of brands have a really clear sense of what a better version of their category might look like. If you're a beer brand, even better times with friends. If you're a car brand, even more freedom and even better driving experience. If you're a travel brand, a nicer pool, bluer skies. If you're a burger brand, the juiciest burger, even more sustainable ingredients. We probably all have a sense of, what the kind of a better version of our category might look like. But if you're really thinking about driving progress, you also need to know what stands in the way. And so you need to know what's not working, what you hate about the status quo or the incumbent thinking in your category or in the world, and what needs changing in order to move forward and drive progress. So challengers intentionally challenge kind of what stands in the way of the progress that they seek to drive. So if we stay with laundry and detergent for the moment, a brilliant example in this space. So if we look at washing powders, washing liquids, parents are one of the biggest audiences for any brand in this category. And at a much broader level, yes, they care about their kids having clean clothes, but for the most part, they care much more about ensuring their kids are happy, healthy, and that they have the best possible childhood. As we've talked about in the kind of detergent category, this obsession with kind of whiteness and stain removal creates quite a sterile clinical view, perhaps, of what family life should look like. And when Persil, or Omo, as I think it's known in other markets, they looked at this more widely. They saw some really alarming stats. I'm sure lots of you are familiar with this campaign or this kind of founding insight, but children were spending less time outside than prisoners in the UK. So a real sense that actually, we might want to create a world where childhoods are more enriched and families are happier, but there's something in the way and there's something kind of stopping that. So instead of challenging their competitors to whiter whites, they decided to intentionally challenge the things that get in the way of families kind of, living their best lives. And they challenged this obsession with removing stains and instead built a really bold brand platform that was all about the belief in dirt is good. So they were encouraging people to get out there, make more of life and care less about the stains. They essentially entirely flipped the category narrative on its head, and they focused instead on kind of giving parents the confidence to let their kids go outside, get dirty, safe in the knowledge that they can still get their clothes clean at the end of the day. But a brilliant example of kind of really knowing what you're challenging and using that at the heart of your brand, in a really compelling way. And this wasn't just a campaign. It's endured for, I think, over 20 years. This is an example of an outdoor campaign that they ran in Turkey this year. So a lovely activation where they turned a kind of pristine advertising billboard into a playground that was, designed to get dirty. Or this lovely example that they've been running in the last few years, which was all about kind of challenging the stigma around period blood in sports for female sports players. Now, I would hazard a guess that many of you know what a better product or a better category might look like, but perhaps you're not as clear on what you're challenging either in your category or in wider culture or society. So if this is something you're starting to think about, I think, this can't just be something that you care about as brand marketers. I think sometimes it's really kind of tempting to kind of want to change the things that we think are wrong from an inside view of our category. It really has to be something that your consumers care about as well. And stats like these should probably act as a wake-up call for all of us. So over half of people can't think of a brand that understands them. Nearly 3/4 are fairly ambivalent to brands. This really suggests that most brands aren't thinking about what it is their consumers really care about and what they might be able to challenge on their behalf. And, the bigger you get, the bigger the risk of bland. So if you're a power brand, it can be really easy to lose sight of this as you get lost in reams of market quant data or nationally representative focus groups, or however it is that you get your insights. Because naturally, the more successful you become, the more customers you get. The more customers you get, the more generic your insights might become, simply because you're trying to find something that connects with a bigger pool of people. And then, of course, as your ambitions grow even bigger, the natural thing to do is to try and become a brand for as many people as possible, and end up often being the opposite. In fact, a brand for everyone, is very often a brand for no one. So one of the things that you can ask if you're really interrogating this idea of what you're challenging on behalf of your consumers is really kind of understanding what the accepted truth or the status quo in your category that just simply doesn't serve your customers anymore. And to do that, you've really got to kind of understand and get much closer to your customers and how they're experiencing your categories, and perhaps go outside of what the data is telling you. So Bobby are a brilliant example of this. If you haven't come across them, we interviewed them earlier on in the year. Highly recommend reading it and spending a bit more time looking at Bobby online, if not going to see if you can find their products if you're in the US. They are the fastest growing infant formula brand in the US since the 1980s. So, until they came along, really no one was kind of shaking up this category. And I think the latest stats show that they've grown at a rate of kind of 6 times the overall infant formula market. And they really understand what's broken for their audience. So this is a quote from the interview with their chief brand officer earlier this year. And she said, "We need to do better for mothers to set them up for success." So they're a brand that's really challenging the accepted wisdom in their category. In this case, this assumption that breastfeeding is going to be easy, it should be beautiful, it should just happen, it's a natural thing to do. And they're fighting for mothers to feel much more supported in their feeding choices and, without judgment or hesitation. So as you can see in this brilliant example from a print ad, they're not afraid to show that they're on the side of mothers and understand kind of what's really going on with their consumers and what needs challenging on their behalf. So maybe a watch out, maybe a reminder, never assume that you know more about your category than the people who are actually buying it. And, brands like Elf, I think someone added this into the chat at the start of a brand that they're jealous of. And we would definitely agree with you. I think they talk about, the only way to create a brand of the people and for the people is by being with the people. And there's lots of brilliant interviews with Corey, their CMO, where she talks about how she really just brings kind of, their social audience, their followers, their fans into the boardroom to really challenge some of the things that they might otherwise be doing internally. So finally, if you're a power brand with a clear monster, clear sense of what you're challenging, congratulations. You're on the way to cracking it. But we would say actually the best examples of brands that stay a challenger as they grow, and that's one of the challenges if you are successful and if you are kind of a power brand, is that they consistently push themselves to find a bigger monster. So Dove, a brilliant but very classic example of this. Their campaign for Real Beauty has really stood the test of time. I'm sure you all know this case study better than us, but partly because they've kind of continually evolved what challenging beauty standards really means. So they started looking at kind of representation of real women in billboard advertising. They've moved to kind of challenging the impact of social media, of filters, and the impact that has on society today. And even more recently, they're really challenging the issues around AI and the kind of images that portrays. So our second principle for you, or thing to think about if you're embracing a challenger mindset. If you want to move your category forwards, be clear on what you're challenging, pick a fight your consumers really care about, and keep finding a bigger monster as you find success. And our final offer for you today, our final kind of principle or challenge, is all about breaking with expectations. We spend, I'm sure, a lot of time as marketers trying to stand out, trying to cut through. But in reality, if you look at advertising as a good proxy, we're probably not as good as we might think we are. And actually, every category has its conventions. I'm sure you've seen similar slides. But wherever you look, you see a sea of sameness, whether it's kind of bottled water, perfume, whiskey, color cosmetics, sun cream, soda, beds. Matt Damon's rider clearly has something about his very specific sea of sameness. And it's not just advertising, you can't move for articles talking about, a world where everything looks and feels the same. And if we go back to brands, this doesn't happen by accident. So studies have shown that within any organization, kind of things that work tend to go through a similar cycle. So you start with good practice, you start that something that's working, and naturally that becomes proven practice. It becomes the thing that works, the thing that's repeatable, and you aspire to do again. Over time, or perhaps as you scale, this becomes corporately preferred practice. So, the guideline that we're setting ourselves to ensure really high standards consistently. And over time, this becomes locked-in behavior. So the way we do things around here is often a kind of a phrase that we might hear in most organizations. Now, for the most part, this is a brilliant thing. It's what creates really commercially successful brand portfolios. It's what gives organizations like P&G their reputation for kind of, the best training you can get in the industry. But there's also a problem here because it focuses us on the safe, the expected choices, the things that we know will work, and it stops us kind of from seeing the things that we don't know yet will work. But equally, it also means, as we've seen, that you're competing with the rest of your category on the same terms. Let's take 99.9% germs if you're a hand sanitizer brand. Or even worse, if we think back to that private label trawler that I'm sure lots of us are worried about, it creates this category playbook where dupes or private labels can really easily copy and thrive. So by playing into this, you're not just advertising your competitors, perhaps, you're actually risking undermining kind of some of the things that you've really built in your brand. And if we stay with advertising for a moment, this comes with a huge financial cost. So our latest research project on the cost of dull, which we've been exploring in partnership with System 1 and Peterfield, as well as Karen Nelson-Field in kind of media. But in advertising, they calculated that being dull costs you roughly 2 times more than being interesting. So essentially, you have to spend twice as much behind a dull ad to have the same impact as you would behind an interesting one. And doubling the cost of something perhaps isn't really what any of us can afford to bear at the moment when budgets are tight and scrutiny on performance is, on the rise. So how can you break out of this sea of sameness? How can you kind of avoid dull and avoid falling into this trap? Well, one of the things that we see time and time again from challenger brands is that they look outside. We spend a lot of time looking inside, kind of obsessing over our category, looking at the data that tells us more about our category, our brands, the people buying our products today. But challengers recognize that alongside that, a different kind of insight can come if you look outside. So this is, again, a classic, but a brilliant example. The founder of Method, Eric Ryan, sums this up perfectly. He says, all the big ideas I could ever need are already out there. I just have to find them and work out how to apply them to my business. So he talks about when they founded the business, instead of just looking at the cleaning products under people's sinks, they looked at the bathroom shelf and they designed deliberately a product that was not just effective and good for the planet, but it looked good enough to put on display on your kitchen counter as you might put your kind of premium high-end fragrances or beauty brands in your bathroom. So this ability to break with expectations often comes from asking intelligently naive questions of your category. And it's often the reason why, challenger brands are founded by individuals who have no prior experience of that category, because they're able to ask the questions perhaps that we don't think of asking when we gain that experience or we get locked into that kind of locked-in behavior or path dependency. And it doesn't have to just start with questioning the product. Often this starts with questioning the dominant emotion in a category. So sun care is a brilliant example of this. If, like me, you're incredibly pale, this is a really important category. But it's a category where the dominant emotion is one of safety and reassurance. It's all about protection, prevention, damage, even death in many places. And Vacation Inc. are a brand that completely break with these expectations. They challenge this kind of dominant emotion of fear and protection, and they insert a completely new one into the category, an emotion all around fun. They talk about leisure-enhancing sunscreen, and they bring that to the world with a really cool kind of 80s aspirational aesthetic, maybe reminding us of a time when things were a bit more kind of fun and free. I love this quote from their founder. He talks about every touch point transporting you to a vacation state of mind. So inherently quite different to the state of mind you might feel when you're bombarded by what seems to be becoming quite scary ads from sun cream brands. And that different emotion is reflected in how they think about their products and how they think about innovation. So products like Classic Whip, you can see that kind of fourth from the left on this screen. This was a TikTok sensation a few years ago, but as the name suggests, it comes out like whipped cream. There was a brilliant insight behind this that people were more likely to apply their sunscreen if it was an enjoyable experience. And so they looked at other categories where the product was fun to use or get out of the container, and whipped cream was somewhere that they took inspiration. Or some of their products like Chardonnay oil, which instantly smells like sunny afternoons, lovely copy. But these challenges like Vacation, they're resisting the expectations of their category. And that, by inserting a new emotion, they're showing up in ways that really break with the expectations or challenge the codes and the conventions that others have set. So what intelligently naive questions can you ask of your category to break with expectations? And have a think, what's the dominant emotion in your category? What might happen if you insert a new one? So we've kind of given you three ways you can start to embrace a challenger mind, and that we think are really important for any power brand or any, even kind of established or large brand in a category. And hopefully, I can't see anyone, but hopefully you're kind of nodding along, feeling a bit inspired. But of course, if you're a power brand or you work in a big organization, doing any of these things becomes harder the more established you get. You probably recognize this path dependency chart that I talked about earlier. And I think if you work in a big successful organization with set ways of doing things, sometimes it can feel like kind of change is steering an oil tanker. Unlike the smaller challengers who maybe, can feel like they're much more agile, you're probably faced with kind of layers of approval, stakeholder alignment, all of those things to really be able to really embrace this mindset. So if you're going to think like a challenger within a power brand or within an established organization, you're going to have to also create a different kind of culture, at least within your teams. It's not just about how you develop your brand strategy. It's about how you think and behave and the codes that you set yourself for really pushing this mindset. You're going to have to think like necessary pirates, as this book suggests. So there's lots we could talk about here, and I'm not going to go into it today. But Adam Morgan, our founder, has written a brilliant book on this, and a couple of things that we thought would be interesting, just, a few bits of advice from lots of the consulting work that we do. Firstly, I think so much of this and about kind of embracing this mindset in our experience is about bringing the right people with you. So to think and behave like a challenger, it takes more than just a couple of passionate individuals. It takes more than a really committed brand team or a really committed agency partner. And really, without the right kind of leadership or stakeholder engagement on this journey, it can feel quite impossible. So at Eat Big Fish, we often talk about kind of hunting as a pack. bringing a much wider audience into the way that you're thinking. And in our experience, the best kind of strategies succeed not because they're found in a snazzy PowerPoint, but because they're built by a group of people beyond the brand team that are aligned and motivated by this bigger ambition or this direction, and really committed to move forwards together. So sometimes, the first step in this is just about making the case for change really visible, really easy to understand. And just one kind of thing that might be interesting if you find yourself struggling to kind of get other people in your organization to really think this way. We've actually just built a really easy to use diagnostic tool. I think Sarah's adding a link to the chat. That can help you just take a fresh look at whether your category is dull. So if you really want to get others in your organization to realize that perhaps the status quo, the way you've always done things, isn't cutting through, sharing this might just be an easy way to get other people to kind of come on this journey with you and discover for themselves, what might need changing and what no longer kind of serves your brand or your ambition. And of course, another, so much of this thinking or doing things differently is about building momentum. And this is going to require different models of success. So we loved this example from Clorox recently. They're really interesting kind of power brand or kind of power brand house who are doing some really interesting things. And they're talking about some of the bold moves that they've been doing in social media, which are really different to how they might have shown up in the past. And their CMO, Eric Schwartz, talks about the risk of kind of getting in our own way as an organization, and actually, to really embrace some of these bolder approaches to social media, which is what they're trying to do. They had to agree and accept not to smother the activity with too much measurement at the beginning. And, judging something new by old metrics is just likely to set you up for failure. So really thinking about how you might need to find different models of success for thinking differently is, of course, really, really important. So that is it from our presentation. Hopefully lots in there that's reaffirming or interesting or new. We wanted to kind of give you a couple of practical things, and hopefully there are some questions here that you can ask yourself, you can ask your clients, your team, to really think about different ways you can embrace a challenger mindset. So I'm going to stop sharing. I can see the chat has been pinging, although I haven't been keeping up with it. So I'm going to rely on Jamie to share and get us kick-started on the questions.
Definitely. Thank you so much, Susie. That was great. I think few people can make hand sanitizer seem that interesting. So well done. We've got a lot of really good questions. Hopefully none too hard, but there are some good ones in here. We will start with this one, going back to the surf campaign.
Yes.
One of our audience members asked about the surf campaign regarding how you can be credible in a new benefit space when it isn't an original point of strength. Could you talk to some of the research that they did to get to this point? And perhaps off the top of your head, do you know how long it took for this new brand identity to take off and show some positive results?
That's a brilliant question. Disclaimer, I did not work on that. So some of the details we can follow up. But I know kind of from speaking to the team that did, on the first question, which was kind of more around how do you build credibility in a different space, there was a really interesting approach that they took to research, I think. So instead of kind of, so two things that really struck out from the work that they did. I think obviously if you're looking at moving into a new space, then most times that data isn't available. So, you're not going to have the proof points to give you the confidence that that it's going to work. If not, it wouldn't be a new space. And so I think they made a deliberate effort to look at different categories where they could understand proxy data points that were increasing. So, again, it comes back to that thing of looking outside. So looking at other categories and the data that suggests that there is success and there is, growing opportunity in different spaces. So I think they looked at things like fragrance, they looked at things like fashion, those kind of things. And then, I guess the other thing that they did that was really interesting was kind of, changing their approach to risk and what they were looking for in the data. So I think one of the things that we often see is that if you're doing market research or you're doing, you're doing, kind of speaking to consumers and asking them to react to things like campaigns or product innovation, we're kind of hardwired to look at the consensus. We're kind of hardwired to look at the things that most people like, and actually, most times that's going to make you look at the things that are expected, or the things that are already happening, or that they're conditioned to expect. So I think what they did in that example was that they looked at the I was going to say flavors, the fragrances that were much more polarizing, because actually if they really wanted to challenge what was going on in the category, then finding the things that people already knew that they liked and perhaps could get somewhere else probably wasn't going to cut it. So I love that example, because I think even just looking at the data that you have, and having the confidence to look at what's the polarizing view on that data, what are the things that stick out of the edges, can be a really nice way of thinking. Yeah, Craig, I love that. Just in the chat, innovation lives in the margins. It's not easy to do. We take safety in numbers literally, but it's just an interesting thing that you can kind of keep an eye out for.
Yeah, awesome. Love that. It's very insightful. And just a quick one as well, slightly deviating from the CPG chat. Can the challenger brand concept apply to B2B companies as well in the same sort of way?
Yes, absolutely. I mean, we've focused on kind of CPG in this webinar. We do a lot of work with B2B brands. And I think, for the same reasons I said at the start of why we're interested in power brands, we're equally interested in kind of in B2B brands, because I think there is much more of an assumption that they don't think like challengers. And so lots of these principles really do still apply. So, if you looked at that example of kind of the sea of sameness, we have exactly the same set of charts. If you're a B2B brand, it's remarkably similar in any category. And actually, that idea of kind of path dependency and kind of the journey of proven practice and locked-in behaviors, we see that kind of perhaps even more in a lot of kind of service brands or professional service brands. So absolutely, B2B brands, as much as any other brand, can and should think like challengers. It's a really kind of compelling way to cut through.
Yeah, definitely. Well, that kind of segues nicely into the next question about sort of what are those sort of organizational barriers to acting like a challenger, and how do you overcome them?
That's a brilliant question, which we could probably talk about that for a long time. I mean, we talked about kind of that path dependency. I think that's definitely one of the biggest ones. Not that it exists everywhere, but typically, I guess the first thing is about recognizing it and challenging it. I think not everything needs to be challenged. I think it's often about agreeing kind of where you can challenge the status quo and what does deserve to remain sacred. But I think, just from working with a range of clients and organizations, often there isn't necessarily the space or the recognition to challenge some of those things. And then I think the other organizational barrier is really that kind of the culture or the mindset around risk taking, and the risk, the mindset that surrounds what's the risky thing to do and what's the responsible thing to do. And I'm sure, as you've kind of taken from this presentation and our point of view, if you're an incumbent and a challenger, you probably see risk and responsibility almost as the opposite. That's really hard. You can't just flick a switch. It's not as simple as saying everything we thought was responsible was risky and everything we thought was risky is now responsible. But I do think internally you need to recognize that you're going to have to challenge that, and you need people on board that can kind of support you in taking risks. So whether it's like that Schwartz example of kind of carving out space for you to accept that things are a risk, but that it's a necessary risk, I think is really important. And then I think just related to that, like we see time and time again that the biggest risk is typically financial, and often it can often be easy to leave the kind of the finance folk out of the picture until you're kind of presenting your brand strategy or your plan at the end for approval. And I think that's often a a big mistake. I think bringing that kind of a very different group of people with very different language, perspective, priority into the kind of conversation is really, 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 really important. I mean, again, really hard, but a really important thing to do. And that's often lots of what we do. You'd be surprised that finance people are great people in brand workshops. So never overlook them.
Yeah, definitely. And kind of staying on that point, I mean, obviously risk gets even riskier when you're looking at kind of the unpredictability of the world right now, everything going on. And so in that sense, how would you look to optimize your organization or team?
Oh, that's a brilliant question. So in the context of kind of wider.
In the context of the unpredictability of the world.
Yeah. That's a brilliant question. I think it comes down to again, like the balance. So even if there is, there are places where you just have to do things, or you're trying to kind of not stay afloat, that sounds really dramatic, but there are brilliant basics that you have to do. I think it's just looking for the places where you consistently keep this mindset, even if it's just as simple as encouraging your team to always challenge whether or not the way you've always done things is still the right way to do. You might conclude it is, but I think even when it's kind of feels like it's lots is changing, I think just that mindset, I think we really believe that's important.
Great. We've got another good question. How many challenger brand teams do you think behave as a challenger deliberately versus instinctively? I get the feeling that in many cases, it's the organizations and brands that are led by people who naturally think this way, rather than trying to reverse engineer and change the cultural thinking.
That's a brilliant question. Yeah, I think so. I think it's easy to, yeah, if you look at a lot of kind of challenges, they're founder led. It's an individual or a group of individuals with a really strong vision, and that kind of permeates down. I don't necessarily think that that's the only way, and I think we certainly see that actually, lots of the businesses that we work with are not driven by one kind of founder that's there for eternity. And that's, if you are interested in that, I think that's lots of what's covered more in the book I mentioned, The Pirate Inside, in terms of how you create a challenger culture that can build momentum and change within an organization. So I definitely don't believe that it has to come from the top. I think it has to be embraced by the top, or by a strong voice individually. But I really do believe that and we see kind of in the work that we do that it can be built from teams, and also built within organizations that have perhaps never had that mindset before. So I don't think it needs to be inherent in your kind of founding culture or your DNA. We see lots of kind of success where organizations adopt it counter to what their kind of they might have thought their culture was in the past.
Great. Well, I'm sure that's hopefully a bit reassuring to people that have tuned in today that are looking to bring that into their strategy. We've got one more time for one more question. So just quickly, what are your thoughts on anchoring strategy in known consumer insights?
Hmm.
For example, what customers will tell you they care about slash expect versus leading the consumer to think differently or expect something new in a category. What is the role of the consumer voice for a challenger, and when are the right moments to lean on the consumer versus creativity gut, or the big challenge in the category you see that maybe they just don't yet?
Yeah, that's a brilliant question. And it's a discussion that we have a lot. So I think really understanding your consumers and what they think is critical. I think though that sometimes we kind of do it, or yeah, I think there's a tendency to kind of use consumers as validation. So, can we get as many people as possible to agree that what we've said is what they agree with, kind of thing, or we're looking at large kind of data sets and and trying to understand where the consensus is. So I think if you just rely on consumers telling you what they want, you're never really going to challenge some of the expectations in the category. I think that there is a role for consumers kind of at all points. I think often actually they're brought in really late in a process. And or in thinking about your brand, so they might be brought in at a testing phase, or they might just be brought in at a high level from a kind of research phase. And I think consumer research or understanding consumers is often limited to things like focus groups or quantitative data or panels or things like that. And actually, there are insights on consumers that can come from literally getting out into, I don't know, if you're a drinks brand, going to a bar and noticing what everyone else is doing in the bar or how they're drinking something, or if you're a drinks brand, actually not going to a bar and going to a theatre and understanding what kind of how people are engaging in entertainment or leisure or things like that. So I think yeah, in short, I think anchoring your strategy in consumer insights is critical, but they don't have to come from the places that you might always have kind of relied on.
Yeah, completely. That's a great answer. And I agree with Craig, my kind of research.
Yeah, I
I think we've all
know.
earned a bit of that kind of research.
Yeah,
It's a
exactly.
Thursday after all. Well, that is all the time that we have. Thank you so much, Susie. That was a brilliant presentation. Expected nothing less. Thank you, everyone who tuned in. I hope you found this useful. If you have any questions for us, feel free to drop us an email and see you at the next one. Thank you, everyone. Have a good
Thank
rest
you,
of your day.
everyone. Thank you so much for joining.